Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I want to give my thanks to Dr. Heise and Dr. Ford for this invitation. It's a great opportunity to come and see the great work being done here at the Institute. And also, I always appreciate the opportunity to talk about self-control and willpower. The subtitle of our book says this is the greatest human strength. Now, I know people say extravagant things to try to sell books, but someone with a scientific training, can that be justified? Is there some basis for saying that, some evidence we can point to? And I think it is. I think there's a fair statement. More and more work is coming out all the time indicating the benefits of self-control. And I can contrast that with self-esteem, which I focused and studied early in my career. We had hopes that high self-esteem would produce all sorts of benefits, but self-esteem was mostly a flop. Unfortunately, it was an honest mistake because they found out that, for example, that children who have higher self-esteem do better in school. So we thought, well, wouldn't that be great? Just boost I mean, in America, we're always looking for ways that we can get kids to learn better and perform better in school without having to do more homework. So just loving themselves seemed like a great recipe. But what it turned out is that the correlations were real, but self-esteem was a result, not a cause. And when they tracked people over time, getting good grades led to higher self-esteem later, but having higher self-esteem did not lead to getting good grades later. However, precisely that same sort of evidence has been confirming the value of self-control, that measuring self-control, even fairly early in life, has been shown to predict all sorts of better outcomes all along. Children with good self-control grow up to become adults who do better in school, better in work, earn more money, have better relationships to others, they're more popular, their close relationships are more stable and durable, they're happier, they experience less stress in life, they're better adjusted to their surroundings. Both their mental and their physical health show significant improvements if self-control is high. They behave better in all sorts of behavioral measures, like whether they've ever been arrested, certainly things like spousal abuse and intimate partner abuse, even restraining prejudice and so on. Self-control is good for that. And at the far end of life, people with good self-control live longer. Indeed, it's, as I say, it's hard to identify any major personal pattern of personal problems that don't have some element of self-control failure in them. So I think on that basis, we can make a fair claim that it is one of the greatest human strengths and possibly the greatest. In terms of what it is, I think of self-control as the capacity to change yourself, or in psychology we talk about responses, so it's overriding one response. You can change your thoughts into something else, make yourself concentrate, shut that annoying song out of your mind, controlling your emotions, restraining anger and anxiety, things like that. Impulse control is quite familiar, not just with eating and dieting, but restraining aggressive impulses, sexual ones, antisocial ones, and so forth. And last, self-control is important for performance, making yourself persevere when things are difficult or frustrating, concentrating, figuring out where to trade off speed versus accuracy, all those things. So it's highly useful there. The technical term for self-control that the scientific literature uses is self-regulation. I like the term regulate because it means change, but not just any change, it means change based on an idea. So when the government regulates how buildings are made, for example, it doesn't just say do it differently. It says, well, there's certain standards, certain things that you have to live up to, that the building has to have a certain number of windows and doors, the toilets have to flush, the heat has to work, so on and so forth. So it's making people change their behavior to conform to ideas, and self-regulation means changing your own behavior to conform to values, standards, norms, laws, all the things, indeed, that culture is based on. I mean, I think of the human being as essentially created by nature and evolution, but for culture. Culture is our biological strategy. Culture as a new kind of social system is how we solve the problems of survival and reproduction that every species faces. We make these complex social systems of sharing information and working together with people we're not related to on these various tasks. That's how we do it. It's been very successful for it, but it requires people to change their behavior to conform to the rules and requirements of the system. Among those, morality. Sometimes self-control has been called the moral muscle. I'll get to the muscle part later, but it's the capacity that enables you to do what is right, to resist the temptation to sin or misbehave or whatever your preferred term is. For that. And indeed, even free will, the philosophers have gotten interested in our work because it's one basis for free will. So, in terms of how it works, I'm going to describe a study that we've just published early this year. Many basic facts about motivation and desire are not known, and we didn't even know how often do people have wants, let alone how often do they try to restrain them. So how often people are restraining impulses, that would give one idea of how people, how much they're using their self-control on a daily basis. There was lots of laboratory work on self-control, but seeing what people do in real life is a little more difficult. So what we did in this study is have people wear beepers as they went around about their daily lives, and it was a small, actually medium-sized town in central Germany. A couple hundred people wore beepers, and whenever the beeper went off, they're supposed to stop and say, "Are you having a desire right now? If so, what are you desiring? How strong is it? If you're not having one now, did you have one in the last half hour? How strong? Is it in conflict with your other desires? Are you resisting the desire?" And then you end up doing what you desire. Among the findings, it looks like people do restrain some, not all. I mean, if they're not restraining the desire, then well, you don't always act on every desire, even if you're not restraining it yourself. I mean, sometimes, I don't know, you don't have a gun. But for whatever reason, as you see, about two-thirds to three-quarters of desires are enacted. If you don't resist them, if you do resist, that drops to 17%. So it's a huge drop, and that means that your own process of resisting your desires is likely used quite a bit every day, and with great success. Not perfect success. There's still 17% there, but considerable success. In terms of how much that happens, extrapolating from, remember we were just beeping people throughout the day, and we can extrapolate from those findings to say how much our desires felt. It looks like the average person is in a state of desire 8 hours a day, spends 3 to 4 hours a day resisting desires. So the self-control is something that people use quite a bit. And then there's a glorious or naughty half hour a day that is spent indulging in temptations that you have previously resisted. What else do we find? Now, a crucial point in terms of the effectiveness of self-control or the operation of it is that the energy that's based on, akin to the folk concept of willpower, that's limited. And that's something that in my laboratory and now in quite a few others, that has been studied rather extensively. We call these effects ego depletion. It looks like some kind of energy gets used up when you exert self-control, so that if another demand for self-control comes along soon after that, you have less energy available for it, less willpower, and so one sign of it is that you tend to do worse on the second. I can describe one of the early experiments that we did to show this sort of point. We told people in psychology you can't usually tell people exactly what they're studying, because then they get all very self-conscious about that. And certainly if we tell them, "Come on in, we're going to test your willpower," we'd get people who are in a strange mental state by the time they arrive. So we told them, "No, we're just studying how well you can remember things that you've tasted." But because of that, we'd ask you not to eat anything for 3 hours before the experiment. So they come to the lab and they're hungry, they've skipped lunch or whatever. And then we brought them into the actual laboratory session, and this part, I guess, was a little bit mean. We'd set up a microwave oven and bake chocolate chip cookies in there. And you know how it blows out the delicious aroma. So we knew it was good because other people at offices on the hallway were complaining, "I'm trying to do my statistics, and you got that chocolate chip flavor all day." So anyway, our participant comes for the study, is hungry, missed lunch, and then comes in, there's this delicious aroma. We seat him or her at a table, and there's a tray of these freshly baked cookies, and in case they weren't into cookies, also chocolate candies, all tastefully arranged in a very appealing structure. And also on the table, there's a bowl of radishes. By random assignment, sometimes the experimenter says, "Well, you're going to be in the radish condition, so your task is to taste the radishes, and just don't touch the cookies and chocolates there for other people in the experiment." So what we wanted them to do, is use up their willpower resisting the temptation. We left them alone for 5 minutes, ostensibly to eat a radish, so that they could think that they could get away with it. Of course, we didn't trust them, so we secretly observed people through a little observation window, and they looked like they were tempted. There were lots of longing glances at the chocolates, and people picked them up and sniffed them and put them back. But nobody actually bit into the forbidden food, and everybody managed to eat the better part of a radish. Now, we had 2 control conditions. One of which was told to eat the chocolates and not the radishes. That was no problem. And then in case there's anything special about food, we had a no-food control group. But the ones we were interested in are, of course, the ones who had to sit there seeing those chocolates and smelling those chocolates and wanting those chocolates and cookies, but instead have to make themselves eat those stupid radishes. Then the next part of the procedure, we took them to a different room, and this was borrowed from stress research, which we see how long people work at a task that's very difficult and frustrating before they give up, because that takes self-control too. You feel like quitting, you're not getting anywhere, and you have to make yourself keep trying and keep at it. And so we measured how long. These were actually unsolvable puzzles, because it spoils the experiment if they solve it. But if you just make difficult solvable ones, it's the same result. Anyway, as you see the results there, the radish condition, people quit more than 10 minutes faster than the others. So resisting the temptation to eat chocolates and cookies, that took something out of them, that used up some kind of inner resource that they then did not have to enable them to keep trying and keep working and keep persevering at the puzzle. And it was a big effect. For a laboratory measure, this is a rather large effect. 5 minutes of resisting the cookie temptation took 10 minutes off their perseverance on the task. Anyway, that's the kind of laboratory evidence that's built on. There are our laboratory, many others have replicated. Some British folks published a meta-analysis last year that combined results of many studies. They confirmed, yes, this is a real effect, at least in the laboratory, but it's harder to get evidence of it outside the lab. When we finished the other study with the beepers, it made me think, could we get any evidence from that to test whether this is going on in everyday life? So what we did is we took people's the beeps that we had, checking them all day. We said, how recently have they resisted another desire, and how often have they resisted a desire today, and kind of made up an index of how depleted they were. Obviously, we missed a lot, so any effect at all would be remarkable, because we're only beeping them once every 2 hours, and they might have had other desires that came and went and were resisted in between. But for whatever we did happen to pick up in our random interventions in their lives, we could build a probe there, and then we could see the next time you're resisting a desire, are you more likely to fail? In other words, give in and actually indulge it. And sure enough, if you look at the top line, if they're not resisting the temptation, then it makes no difference whether they've resisted previously, whether they're, in other words, in a willpower depleted state. That didn't make any difference. But look at the red line. The more often and the more recently they've resisted another desire, the more likely they are to give in to the next one that they try to resist. So indeed, it does look like, even outside the laboratory, your ability to control and restrain your desires does get weaker as the day goes on, as you use it. After the day at the beach, of course, not making too many demands on your willpower, then you should be fine at the end of the day and be able to resist desires that happen to crop up then. But if it's been a day of resisting various desires, then late in the day, you're in this depleted state. We looked some other findings from that study. We looked at people who were scored high on a questionnaire measure of trait self-control. And we looked for how that might predict what they did in everyday life. Well, obvious prediction is, you use your self-control for resisting desires, so you should be resisting desires more if you're good at self-control. But no, it was significant in the opposite direction. That was kind of a surprise. What it suggests, well, let me explain what that means in a moment. Let me put it together with a couple other things. They have less guilt. Probably because of not doing things that they're not supposed to. Also showed lower stress, they were happier, and so on. What this suggests is kind of a new way of thinking about willpower, is that people use it to set up their lives, to operate in an effective way on routines and habits that will guide them to the right thing. So rather than waiting to bail yourself out in a crisis, you use it to establish habits, to break bad habits and establish good ones. In the book, we call this about playing offense rather than defense. Don't wait for the moment of crisis. For example, trait self-control, people with good self-control do a lot better in work. One of the biggest effects is their performance in work and school. People might think, okay, what do you need self-control for to do well in work and school? Well, it's probably to make yourself stay up all night the night before your paper is due to get it done, and people will remember that as the heroic act. But that's not really really the right way to do it. The people with good self-control have better work habits, and we're plugging away all along, so they don't get themselves into that moment of crisis where they have to use their willpower to bail themselves out. Or I can depict this in a more pictorial fashion. Here's our stereotype for many people of self-control from antiquity. This is Odysseus / Ulysses coming home from the siege of Troy. If you remember the story from school, the sirens sing these beautiful songs, and the sailors want to hear them better, so they steer closer to the rocks to try to hear the song better and sail the ship onto the rocks, and it breaks up and sinks, and that's supposedly it. Well, Odysseus wanted to hear the tunes, so here he is on the deck struggling to try to resist the temptation. He's got some pre-commitment devices that he uses to help himself. He's tied himself to the mast, so he can't grab the steering wheel. I don't know, apparently dressing up in women's clothes is supposed to help. The guys rowing the galley, they have their ears stopped up. So anyway, this is our classical image of willpower struggling to resist the temptation. But apparently people with good self-control took a different route home and avoided the problem altogether. All right. Now, I think self-control in general seems to work like a muscle. That's a handy analogy for if you want to understand the dynamics of willpower. What I've explained so far is the first of these lines. It seems to get tired, just like a muscle. When you use it, it gets tired. So when you use your self-control all day, or you use it in a laboratory task, resisting temptation or whatever, you've kind of tired it out a little bit, and so it isn't quite as strong for the next challenge that comes along. Two other ways in which it's like a muscle. People conserve energy. An athlete won't play at full strength for the whole contest until his or her energy's gone and then face plant on the court and be carried off. Rather, once you start to get tired, you start to conserve your energy. You save it. If you're running a long distance, you don't go as fast as you possibly can. You pace yourself. Or in a tennis match, you'll let some of the balls that you can't get go away. Save your energy for the ones you can get or for the important points. And that's what we found with self-control too. It's not that self-control is that their willpower is depleted to zero after 5 minutes of resisting. This was somewhat interesting to us in doing this research, because we're using up people's willpower and being in our experiment and then sending them out into the world. And are we sending them out with no willpower to defend themselves? They'd be at the mercy of anyone who wants to sell them something or have sex with them or convince them to join a religious cult or whatever. But no, it turns out people do conserve their energy very well, so they can summon it up when something is important. I think maybe in some ways the best analogy is a well, which it gets harder and harder to get the water out of the well, but it never really runs dry. There's still some way down in there. The one other parallel between self-control and a muscle is that yes, it gets tired when you use it, but if you use it regularly, it seems to get stronger. There are about a dozen published studies now indicating that after people go and perform self-control exercises for a couple weeks, and these are even be fairly arbitrary ones, like using your left hand for things you normally use your right hand for, or changing your patterns of speech, or whatever. That people do these things for a couple weeks, and then come back to the laboratory and do better on laboratory tests of self-control. The things that had nothing to do with whatever they were exercising. Indeed, the first study that we had that worked like this, we told people just to work on their posture for 2 weeks. We said, whenever you think of it, sit up straight, stand up straight. Because that's, again, self-control is about changing your behavior, overriding some response, natural to slouch and things like that. So make yourself stand up straight. And the people who did this, and we came and we tested them on various other tests that had nothing to do with posture, but they showed substantial improvements there. So I think that's an important message about not just self-control, but how psychology can really contribute to the greater welfare. Psychology has really found only 2 traits that predict success through a broad range of walks of life and spheres of endeavor. These are intelligence and self-control. We've been trying for a century and not much success at producing permanent changes in intelligence, but we can improve self-control even in adults. So it is an important avenue by which we can make people's lives better. I want to emphasize another principle. Some people say, well, I have good willpower for this, not so good for that. Well, there's one willpower resource. It's the same resource you use for everything. It's what we call a domain general property. So maybe you have good willpower for getting your bills paid on time and not good willpower for getting a haircut or whatever. But it's the same. You could devote it. Now, it is a limited quantity, so people will use it for one thing and not for another. But it is one resource that you use for the same, for all different tasks. And that's why in these studies we have people deplete their willpower by, say, resisting the temptation to eat chocolate and cookies. And then we measure it in a different domain. How long do they persevere in a challenging task? So again, these are the 4 domains that most of the research literature is emphasized: controlling thoughts, controlling feelings, impulse control, and task performance. People use their willpower for all 4 of these, and all these involve self-control. Again, a common resource, and doing any one will affect your ability to do any other. Now, willpower actually has uses even beyond self-control. If, given how important self-control is, if this resource were only used for self-control, that would already make it a really important part of the self. But further work has come out suggesting that willpower can be depleted by other things. Decision-making, for example, uses decisions. Decision-making uses willpower, so that after making choices, people do worse at self-control. In the first study like this, we had people make a lot of choices between consumer products. Would you rather have a red T-shirt or a blue T-shirt? Rather have a lemon-scented candle or an almond-scented candle? And on and on and on, choices like that. Other people looked at all the same items, rated them, and stuff like that, but did not make choices. And then we tested their self-control, and I think one of the classic tests is how long can you hold your hand in ice water without pulling it out? Again, the people who had made the decisions, it used up some of their willpower from making choices. I'd rather have a blue T-shirt than a red one. By doing that, then they had less willpower left over to perform well on the subsequent tasks. Also, we have some new studies, is still not published, that willpower is useful for initiative, that people who lack willpower tend to just go along with the status quo or the default option, or leave things as they are. But to get up and take action, to correct a problem, to take things in a new direction or whatever, that takes willpower also. So after people have exerted self-control, they will have less initiative, and vice versa. Going to the decisions. Oops, come on. I'm not political, but here's a photo of our president looking very dapper, I'm sure you'll agree, in his gray suit. Well, it turns out he wears only gray suits because I guess someone in his staff read our book or the research that we're doing and says, I don't want to make decisions about what I'm eating or wearing, and it's quite valid. This is completely in principle with all the research findings, that making decisions uses up the energy, and if you have to make many important decisions, you don't want to squander your willpower deciding what to wear or what to eat. And it also affects self-control, as a recent blogger helpfully explained the same phenomenon, as Catherine says, doing things that occasionally, of course, no politician would actually ever do that, anyway, let me spend a couple minutes here talking about what the patterns, how decision-making changes. I've talked about how self-control gets worse after you've depleted your willpower and used up your energy in other acts of self-control. How does decision-making change? These things, this work is still in progress, and more things are coming out all the time, but here are some patterns that have been shown. For one thing, if people can postpone the decision, they're glad to do that. People who's in the state of ego depletion would prefer not to choose. So I'm going to go to the decision-making conferences periodically. They do research like, well, here's one camera and here's another with all these specifications. Which one would you buy? But in real life, people often have a choice of not buying anything and keep looking. So we included that option in there. And sure enough, the people who had expended their willpower making exerting acts of self-control, they were more likely to say, oh, I don't want to decide now. I'm not going to pick anything. Just keep looking, or go to a different website and have fun with that. Compromise. People in their normal state are real compromisers. They will look at the different look at the different options or different positions or whatever, trade them off, figure out the optimal point of trading them off. But compromise goes out the window once people's willpower is depleted. So after acts of self-control, even things like price and quality. Most people, when they're in full possession of their willpower, they'll say, well, where can I get the best value for my deal? I don't want to get, I want to save some money, but I want to get some decent quality too. Whereas once they're depleted, they go, give me the cheapest or give me the best. In other words, they just pick one dimension and go to the extreme on it. They don't bother trading off the two dimensions. And as the decision-making researchers have said, this compromise is a mentally complex and strenuous sort of effort. It's much easier to say, just give me the cheapest. The default option, I think I already mentioned, that many decisions, there's an option that you can do nothing, and that will count as a decision, and the more people are depleted, the more likely they are to do that. There's a great study with Audi dealers where you buy an Audi, you have quite a few decisions to make about what features you want. So they listed the decisions in one order, and then they gave other people the decisions in reverse order. What it turned out is as they went along, regardless of what order, they're more and more likely to pick the default option. Audi dealers, turns out, some of them had already figured this out because they start with the really demanding but trivial decisions like the 230 kinds of interior fabric that you have to choose among. You use up all your willpower deciding which shade of taupe would match your mood the best. And so then it's gone. Then by the time you come to the other things where extra wheel rims or rust proofing or whatever, then your willpower is just take whatever standard. And that can get extremely expensive or very profitable for the dealers. Other decisions, people make more impulsive, self-indulgent sort of choices when their energy is depleted. So we had one study with Yale students, either before or after studying, thinking that would use up their willpower. And then we said, well, you can choose which movie you want to see next weekend. It's not to see tonight, it's to see next weekend. And some of these were rather highbrow intellectual sorts of movies. Others were lowbrow, sleazy sorts of entertainments. In the full possession of their energy and power, being the young intellectuals that they are, they tended to choose the highbrow movies. However, after a few hours of studying, they went to choose the much more sleazy, exploding cars and naked peep bodies kind of thing. And last, irrational bias. Sometimes decision-making people have figured out how to show that sometimes decisions get swayed by things that logically should be irrelevant. And there's some nice, very elegant procedures for testing that. And that irrational bias increases when people seem to be depleted. So they somehow don't do the mental work of thinking, this is relevant to the decision, I should base it on this, and not that. They let themselves be swayed by things that logically make no difference. So these are some. I expect there to be more things as well. But the general pattern is when their willpower is depleted, people shift toward a quicker, more efficient, lower energy, but therefore more fallible form of decision making. They want to deal with the process in a low energy fashion, which is what happens when your energy has been depleted. Also relevant to decision making and so on is the ability to think intelligently. Intelligent thought is one of the other candidates for the greatest human strength, but that too depends on willpower. People think much more clearly and logically when they're in full possession of their resources than when they're in a state of depletion. Indeed, what we've tried is have people exert self-control and then take an IQ test, and their scores drop substantially. Your mind does not function as well. Now, I should say not all mental functions are impaired. If you break it down, things like logical reasoning versus rote memory. Rote memory is fine when you're depleted. You can learn new information, commit it to memory, you can bring it back. But logical reasoning, where you have to take something and follow rules to reach a different conclusion, that is seriously impaired. So it looks like the high energy sort of thinking where you have to control your mental processes, follow different rules to move from one set of things to another. Extrapolation is another thing that suffers, where you have to go from one thing to another. That people don't do as well, but straight taking information in and out, that they seem to do well. So your memory, in a sense, works fine. you're not, it's not that many IQ tests have a vocabulary test. Your vocabulary is still there when you're depleted. It's not like my father's 86. He came to visit there, and he was complaining about his memory. And so I told him the joke about the old lady who talked her way out of the traffic ticket. It was usually the pretty young woman, but the old woman, she said, "Oh, you know, where are you going so fast, lady? What's the rush? You're speeding." And she says, "I'm sorry, officer. I'm just trying to get where I'm supposed to go before I forget where I'm going." And so my father liked that. He said, "I've got to remember that joke." The next day, I said, "Well, you remember the joke you wanted to remember?" He said, "What joke?" I said, "The joke about the old lady." "No." He said, "She was speeding." "I don't think I've heard it." I told it to him again. He liked it again. Anyway, depletion is not like that. Your basic memory still works fine, but the reasoning, the difficult, ambitious functions, those seem to be impaired and degraded. In terms of what happens physically with willpower, I mean, we use the term as a folk term. It's somewhat a metaphor. I'm not a brain expert, but just in simple terms, you know, the brain evolved through the different species and so on, basically from back to front. So the back has the simple, this is what I want, how am I going to get it, sort of things, and then the farther front you go with the restraint and control. So the self-control capacities will be located in the front parts, the frontal and the prefrontal cortex in particular. Perhaps a more surprising, interesting body part of the self-control story. It seems to be tied in some complex ways to glucose. Now, glucose is a chemical in the bloodstream that carries the energy from the digestive system to the muscles and to the brain. Glucose, I think, means something like sugar, but it's not made just from sugar. Anything you eat, protein and so on, is particularly good. Neurotransmitters that enable the brain to function are made out of glucose. So you can think of it crudely as fuel for the brain. And we have some evidence that when the glucose is low, that self-control is impaired. Either you can manipulate it to be low. There's some evidence that it drops when people exert self-control, that the levels of glucose in the bloodstream drop. Some other studies not finding that, so that's complicated. But there's lots of glucose in the body. What does seem to work is when people exert self-control, if they get a dose of glucose to replenish it in 10 or 15 minutes or however long it takes to digest, it restores their ability to control themselves. We do this in the lab in a very easy way. Since being in the South, we give people a glass of lemonade when they arrive at the experiment, and by random assignment, it's either a glass of lemonade sweetened with sugar or with Splenda, a diet sweetener. The two taste just as good. They're just as happy with the drink. They can't tell the difference, so it can be double-blind experiment that neither the experimenter nor the participant knows what's in the lemonade. And then when we look it up later, you have to wait 10 or 15 minutes for the sugar to have an effect. But when you check with them later, the people who got sugar don't show the depletion effect of impaired self-control, because presumably when the amount was getting used up, then there was more coming in and more being pumped out by the digestive system. Now, I'm not unmindful of the irony of using sugar to improve self-control. Many people want to use it to restrain that, so I want to caution, don't try this at home. This is just, I mean, seriously, in the laboratory, we just have people for 10 or 15 minutes or an hour at most. So we need something that works fast. And the sugar works very fast. If you want to get a sustained glucose in your own life, or writing a paper or doing a different task all afternoon, you should probably go to protein or something that the body burns slower. The sugar sends you up quickly, but then crashes quickly. Now glucose, it turns out, is indeed used for self-control and decision-making. And we've had even changes in people's logical decision-making as a function of which kind of lemonade they drank, with the sugared lemonade actually restoring their ability to make logical decisions better than the other. Of course, glucose is part of the body's energy system, so it's used for other things too. Physical exertion will drain it, and I haven't really gotten much research evidence connecting physical tiredness, but it hasn't really been tested to self-control. The immune system is another big user of glucose, and this is kind of interesting to me. It's one thing that I always, had good discipline, and when I got sick, the doctor would say, well, you shouldn't work, just take a nap, take it easy. And I think, well, I'm not working like digging ditches or lifting weights or anything. I'm just sitting at the computer working. I can do that. That won't make me sick. But it turns out that was wrong. I mean, for one thing, I noticed that the work I did in that state was generally bad. But there's a reason your body wants to go ahead. It's using all the energy to fight the germs. The immune system is a big user, but an uneven user. So sometimes it's not using any, other times it starts to use a lot. So you want to give it. What your body wants you to do is go to bed and go to sleep for 36 hours. I've tried to do that, and that actually works. It ends up being more efficient in the long run than trying to make yourself work and being sick for 2 weeks. This part of the system that your body uses the energy for fighting disease. Also, some evidence regarding women's premenstrual syndrome, which the mythology surrounding that is that certain women turn into monsters at this particular time of the month or whatever, develop these. But it turns out what happens is at that stage of the menstrual cycle, the body needs a lot of glucose for its reproductive activities, so it pulls it off and doesn't leave as much for self-control. Many women eat more than usual during that stage, but they don't eat enough more to compensate for the increased demands, the metabolic demands of the reproductive system. And so what you see with PMS is not some particular kind of behavior, but sort of a general breakdown in restraints, and they're more likely to do whatever they do. And if they're inclined to shoplift or yell at their partners or whatever, they do those. Drug use increases, and there's no particular drug, almost whatever. If she's a drinker, she drinks more. If she's a smoker, she smokes more. If she, heroin, cocaine, whatever. Her thing is that increases during that stage of the month. The only exception, interestingly, was marijuana, which does not increase with PMS. But marijuana, unlike other drugs, just sort of gives you more of whatever you're feeling now. And I think if you're feeling grumpy and cranky, mad at the world, who wants to double dose of that? What I'm trying to argue here is that your ability to exert self-control and make rational decisions is tied into the body energy system and to the glucose dynamics, and so other things, immune functions, fighting a cold, physical exertion, other demands take their toll on it. Okay, last thing I will talk about before I quit. Oh, I have a little bit of time. Let me say one more thing about glucose and decision making. It was a great article published, I think, right around the time we got an advanced word for it. It's covered in the book, that had to do with decisions by judges on whether people should get parole. They got, this was done in Israel, and they got access to all the parole decisions that the judges would make. The parole decision is somebody's been in prison for a certain amount of time, wants to be released, thinks he's reformed, paid his debt. These are all males. And so the judge has to decide, well, is this person going to send him out into the world or to send him back? And the default is just to send him back because that's safer. The risk for the judge, if you send him out into the world, the guy commits another crime, it makes the judge look bad and reflects bad on the system. So the easy thing is just send them all back. But, many of these guys have indeed paid their debt and reformed and deserve to get it. Well, it turns out that if you come up before the judges first thing in the morning, your chances of getting parole are pretty good. But as the day wears on, your chances get worse and worse. Now, it's not a complete steady downhill, because at 10:30 there's a break where the judges get a banana and a sandwich, and then the likelihood of granting parole goes up again. And then it goes down again and down again. If you're the last one before they have lunch, 15% is your chances of getting parole. 15%, very little. The next guy in line, the first one after lunch, is paroled at about a 2/3 rate. It's a huge jump. So you can see the glucose coming into the system and giving them the energy to make the tougher decision seems to have a significant influence. There's a saying in the legal profession that justice is whatever the judge had for breakfast, and well, we would add it's a snack and lunch too. Apparently, that's having an influence there. Anyway, I think what that shows in a very important real setting with real consequences for serious human beings, that decision-making is indeed affected by the availability of glucose in the decision. And, some sympathy for the judges, too. They are working hard at making these decisions, but as you make decision after decision all day, you eventually use up your willpower that it's consumed there, and you won't be able to make them as effectively later in the day as you could early in the day. So, last thing, what does depletion feel like? What is this state? How do you know when your willpower is down? I can't resist putting up, this is the London Times did a review of our book and captured this pictorially. It's sort of charming. That's their impression of what it looks like. I want to point out she is holding an apple there. It's not always the first thing people notice. But surrounded by temptations. Anyway, it turns out there is no particular feeling that's associated with it. I mentioned the meta-analysis that had combined results of, I think, 80 or 90 different experiments that the British guys did. And they said, well, the behavioral effects are very clear, but the report of what it feels like, the emotion and stuff, there's hardly anything that is worth talking about. You know, a tiny little effect on some studies that they feel a little more tired, and a tiny little effect, sometimes they're a little bit more negative mood. But essentially, there's no feeling that goes with it. So we've tried to follow this up. Is there really no signature, emotional or no subjective feeling at all associated with it? And what turns out that we have had is that actually all desires and feelings seem to be intensified. So in a series of studies, people who are depleted will be more upset by an upsetting movie. They will find the scary pictures to be scarier, but they'll find that the good pictures, good. The puppies look actually cuter to you when you've depleted your willpower. And things you've never seen before, Chinese characters. You like the attractive ones more, you dislike the other ones more. So things are polarized in both directions. So we repeated the hand in the ice water study, which is kind of standard. Well, as usual, the depleted people pull their hand out earlier. That's a familiar part. But we also noted they said the water was colder and more painful. It bothered them more. So in a sense, what depletion feels like, it's turning up the volume on your life in general. All manner of things seem to hit you more strongly. And this, I'm going to point out, this creates practical problems for people who are trying to quit smoking or diet or recover from a drug addiction or whatever. Not only is their willpower depleted by whatever they're doing, but also then the desires are experienced more strongly. So that puts the person in a double vulnerability. I have the depleted person, I have less willpower to resist temptation, and the temptation is stronger than ever. So that's something worth knowing. It would be nicer if nature had given us a big signal so we would know when we were depleted, but that's the one thing to watch out for. All right, to conclude then, our capacity to control ourselves is limited, indeed, but it is powerful. Many people say that they don't have enough self-control, that they wish they had more, and so on. Indeed, a big international survey of several 100,000 people, possibly over 1 million, rating 24 different strengths and virtues that people have. Self-control was the least often listed as one of the best things, and the most often listed as one of my major weaknesses. So clearly a lot of people, the majority, think we don't have enough self-control, but the glass is really half full and half empty. We have a lot more capacity for self-control than any other species. It's probably why we can make culture succeed where other species have not been able to do it, even though it's a tremendous biological strategy. No other mammal on the planet has seen its population increase as astronomically as ours has, nor has it been able to increase its life expectancy. So both survival and reproduction are tremendously benefited by culture. Anyway, this capacity enables us to function there. We really do have a lot. As I said, the glass is half full, but also half empty. We realize the many benefits that it brings, and yes, we would be better off if we had even more self-control than we do have. But don't feel bad. We do have quite a lot. This energy is one of the key bases for self-control. This willpower, we somewhat hesitantly adopted the folk term. Energy makes it possible to exert self-control, to restrain your impulses, to make yourself do the things that you should do, and so on. But that willpower is also used for other important functions, psychological ones, including making decisions and choices and taking initiative. And now we're thinking also that energy seems to be used in fighting illnesses and other sorts of things. And so last, I think it's a fair claim that this is indeed the greatest human strength. It is something that benefits us individually and collectively, quickly. It's something that is probably the greatest gift you can give your child, much more valuable for getting through life than self-esteem. And ultimately, it's something that enables us to be more fully human and to get the most out of our experience. Thank you very much. I will take questions. I want to remind you this is all being recorded, so please no nudity. Okay, start in the front. Sure, all these four. Anyone?
Continuing, is it on?
Yes.
Continuing the point between glucose and willpower, have you looked at diabetics specifically because they have such wild swings in glucose levels?
Yes, that's a good question about diabetics. I have not done that research, but there is research on them. And yes, they do experience problems in self-control. They have plenty of glucose in their blood in many cases, but it doesn't do them any good because their system is not able to metabolize it, to convert it into decision-making and self-control and these things. My co-author, John Tierney, interviewed this, I don't remember his name now, is a comedian who has jokes about being diabetic, and he tells a bunch of stories about he gets in this state and he can't control himself, or he can't even make a simple decision. There's a story about being at the beach where he suddenly knew he had to go and eat something, and he was with his son and said, well, let's put all the toys away in these two buckets that we have. And he couldn't think of how to put which toy in which bucket. So he said, well, the logical way to do it, the first thing he thought of was put them back in the bucket they came in. But then they had to remember that. So he spent all this time, completely wasted time putting this in this toy into this one, and they finally got it right. And they walked up, and he had to go to the bathroom and get something to eat. But they were the same place. It was the men's room and the hot dog stand. And he couldn't decide, should he pee first or eat first? And he just sat down and waited 20 minutes. He couldn't make the decision as to which to do first. You know, obviously doing either first would have gotten him to gotten both done in a faster time. So yes, I'm sympathetic to diabetics having these problems, and it is an issue. We had the thought at one point that when people used to being diabetics, then they used to become to managing control and so on, and there would actually, the experienced diabetics would have pretty good self-control because it would work like exercise. I don't know anybody's tested that, but in the short run, they do seem to have trouble. Things bother them more. The emotional control, impulsiveness, that's more common. Okay, who's next?
Would eating a better diet, you know, so many people in America just eat fast food and stuff like that. Would that help you prevent depletion and improve your willpower is one question, and my other question is, what parameters made you choose a small town in Germany to do your study?
Okay, the second one first. It was not my decision. Würzburg is a medium-sized town. I didn't choose it. I was working with a German researcher at that university there. So he said, well, we'll just run a thing in the local paper, because they had to bring him in people to give them a training and give them the beepers to carry around and stuff. So that was just where it was convenient. So the more profound question in terms of diet, yes. Actually, when we first got these findings, we were very surprised by them, and they were very much at the time out of fashion in psychology. So we looked at the nutrition literature, and nutritionists, without much guiding theory, had collected a lot of data on glucose issues, indicating, yes, that diet does make a difference, and that people with glucose issues and so on, eating the fast food, the high carbohydrates and sugars sort of thing that will give you a boost of energy. So if you have a really important decision to make in the next 15 minutes, well, yeah, it takes 15 minutes, but between 15 and 30 minutes, if you have an important decision to make, then okay, have the real Coke, not the Diet Coke. But if you want something that will last you over a longer period of time, I think sugar and carbs are not advised. That a protein-rich diet would probably do better and do more good in the long run. There are very nicely controlled studies showing some of this. Things like they'd bring a whole class of school kids, tell them nobody eat breakfast, so the kids all arrive at school hungry. They randomly give half of them breakfast and the other them don't get breakfast, and then measure what happens. Well, the ones who had breakfast, they behave better and they learn better than the ones who didn't have breakfast. At 10:30, everybody gets a snack and all the differences disappear. So yes, having the right fuel in the tank does seem to translate into behavior. The rise in ADHD is one of the big mysteries. Was it always there and just not noticed? Has there been an actual change? And if there's been an increase in that, what are the candidates to explain it? The two leading ones people argue are television and the increase in sugar in the diet. And I kind of bet on sugar. Kids consume a lot more sugar now than they do, and it is really has these effects on kids, and that is kind of what the ADHD is, a deficit in self-control, as that just becomes difficult for them. So anyway, that all sorts of things. I haven't done this work, but it's all very plausible. Thank you. Okay, there are 2 more questions here. Okay.
I spent a lot of time in Asia, particularly Korea, and they have a very disciplined or self-controlled society, and they're under tremendous pressure, and so they blow this pressure off and go wild when they're not studying just to balance that out. But do you see any societal impacts on the levels of self-control and willpower?
Yes, absolutely. And you mentioned the Asians in researching the book. I read a bunch of things there, not just was it the battle hymn of the Tiger Mom, but also some of the documented studies about Asian Americans and others. There's a stereotype that they're smarter than the rest of us, but the IQ experts say no, they're not smarter. They're exactly the same, maybe a little bit less, but they get more out of it. They are much more disciplined. As the Tiger Mom book indicated, raising an Asian kid is a lot about discipline and instilling self-control, and so they tend to breed overachievers. So they're way overrepresented among Ivy League students and high school valedictorians. And the same, one of the research studies I read looked at sort of how smart you have to be to become a physician or a lawyer or one of these professional fields. And the threshold is lower for Asians, which means to be white, you pretty much have to have an IQ of maybe 100, I forget the exact numbers, but maybe you have to be 112 or 113 before you have a chance of being successful as a physician. But the Asians can do it maybe at 5 or maybe even 10 degrees lower, depends on which study. And they can be successful at that. So discipline does seem to matter, and yes, I think, in some ways, I think this is the most unfortunate legacy of the self-esteem movement, because many parents took it as, well, I want to protect my kid's self-esteem, so I should never criticize, never set rules, and so forth. And incidentally, that's not even a good strategy for self-esteem. Kids actually have better self-esteem if there are clear rules and they live up to them, and they're punished when they fall short, and they are rewarded when they surpass them. So I think that's unfortunate, because self-control really does a lot more for your child and for society lifelong than self-esteem, which just makes the kid conceited. And so it's unfortunate that the upbringing has gone that direction. But if you just if you have a child, put prominent in your mind that the goal should be to raise a child with good self-control. And even if it's just, your focus, you can already make priority for that and say, oh, I know you didn't get what you wanted, but you didn't throw a tantrum. You showed good restraint there, and I'm very proud of you for doing that. So you single out praise when the kid shows good self-control. And don't tolerate the lack of self-control. You see so many cases, at the shopping mall where they go in and the kid says, I want to go to the toy store. And the parent says, no, we got to do this. And they scream. And finally the kid grabs hold of the door and hangs on and screams the top of his lung. And the parent says, okay, we'll go to the toy store. What do you train the kid there is that losing all control is the way to get your way. And that's the exact opposite of what you want to do. The Asian parents, they say, well, when the child wants something, I'll say, well, you can have that next week if you do good on something else in between. So the reward has to be earned, and then you have to make sure to give the reward. But that way, you learn to delay gratification, work toward rewards, and control yourself and behave yourself at the time. That's really beneficial in the long run. Okay, and one more up front, then we'll move to the back.
That kind of feeds into my question. Have you studied the correlation between willpower and goal-directedness, particularly people who frequently set both short-term and long-term goals? And if there's a positive correlation, as I think there would be, does it, do those people have more delayed fatigue, longer time periods before they are fatigued in decision making if they're more goal directed?
Those are both good questions, and I've not studied those specifically. Those would be worth doing. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that anyone else has done. In general, people with self-control are more successful, so setting goals and pursuing them is a big part of that. Effective self-control, you got to work on having the long-term and the short-term goals. Not too restraining, but managing them effectively. Otherwise, you just sort of blunder through life. I'm not sure what else to say about that. Self-control does help people achieve better at these things. Oh, yeah, the other part of your question was then, do people get strengthened by this? And that has not been specifically studied, I'm pretty sure, but that would follow from everything we would say. That, well, you would get stronger at that if you pursue goals, you set goals and follow them. That kind of, again, the exercise in changing your responses to make yourself conform to the rules, to follow through, keep your promises, pursue your goals, things like that. All those things are good. The old Victorian phrase of building character is not entirely wrong. There's something to it. I mean, think of it as character may not be the term we'd use now, but it does make you stronger as a human being and give you more self-control to pursue other things. And the improvement in self-control really comes as resistance to depletion.
We have time for one more question.
Okay, the man in the back is waving. Yes.
Thanks for taking my question. Your comment earlier about practicing self-control brought to mind fasting, and I'm wondering if you can tell by looking at my frame that I don't practice fasting, but I'm wondering if you've looked into whether people who do practice fasting have better self-control.
Well, I can answer that very briefly. No. But you're right. I mean, the paradox with fasting and dieting and so on, and why self-control doesn't work as well, is because you're depriving yourself of glucose, so you have less available in the system. So we call it the catch-22 or whatever of dieting. That to have willpower, you need willpower to resist food, but to eat, you need willpower. You need to eat to have willpower. I could say also, in connection with it, there is a pretty good body of work that religious people have better self-control. I say I'm not political, I'm not religious either, but I do respect both endeavors. And the strong evidence, I think they started with finding that religious people lived longer than other people. The researchers noticed that and wondered why, and some religious people want to say, well, it's because of God, he's making us live longer, but that's not really a scientifically satisfactory explanation. So what they came around to is that people have good self-control, live longer, and religion supports self-control. So highly religious people are less likely to drink a lot and smoke cigarettes and engage in other dangerous activities. So it's clear that religious people, and no one religion, indeed religious people generally, whatever religion, seem to have better self-control. There are multiple theories about why that is true, and we don't really know which of them. They all could be true for all we know. There's the being in a community of other people where you are will watch out for you and kind of intervene if you're doing badly. There's the building the strength by exercise, the discipline of praying, of meditating, of going to church. That could strengthen you. There's the sense that God is always watching you, so you better not sin because even if you think no person will catch you, that the divine all-seeing eye will note that. All of those could contribute to the greater self-control. So fasting is certainly a religious ritual done in some contexts and takes self-control, but yes, doing it would be another exercise that would be difficult at the time, but doing those things periodically would indeed continue to strengthen the muscle.
Let's thank our speaker.